Hi, I'm Michael Marcoux. I'm a senior and I'm in the business school at the University of Colorado Boulder. It was our hope that this panel would explore the intersection between race, contemporary education, and the future. In the era of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests throughout our country, it is crucial to understand the impact that race has on educational equality, educational discrimination, and educational attainment. Let's work together toward understanding and allyship. Enjoy!
Okay, welcome. And thank you for joining the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel, Racial Impacts on Education Equality. We'd like to thank our donors and sponsors without whom this discussion would not be possible. And we'd also like to thank a wonderful panel of speakers for volunteering their time to join us today. I'm Nikhil Mankekar. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I am the immediate past two-time chair of the City of Boulder Human Relations Commission, sometimes known as the Human Rights Commission, and United Nations Association International Human Rights Award winner. And I'm very excited to be hosting this panel. We have an amazing panel today. I was so excited to see them because I've been a long time moderator and panelist at CWA and also attended CU Boulder. And this is definitely one of the best panels we have ever had at CWA. So we're lucky to have this panel joining us today. To start off with, I'll introduce each panelist and then we'll move to opening comments from each panelist. Joining us, we have Wisdom Amuzu. He is the co-founder and executive director of Empower Community High School in Aurora, Colorado. Wisdom graduated from CU Boulder with a BA in Communications and a certificate in Leadership Studies, fellow alum. After college, Wisdom joined Teach for America and was awarded the 2015 Sue Lehman Teaching and Learning Award. In 2016, Wisdom co-founded the Hadanu Collective, and he is a 2017 Camelback Ventures Fellow and winner of the 2017 TFA Social Innovation Award. Again, Wisdom currently serves as the executive director of Empower Community High School, an innovative student-led high school grounded in transformative resistance located in Aurora, Colorado. Welcome, Wisdom. Next, we have Ashanti Golar. She's the president of Emerge. Emerge is the only organization dedicated to recruiting and training Democratic women to run for office. Many of my close friends have gone through the Emerge program and successfully run for office, by the way, Ashanti. So you're big in Colorado and big in Boulder. Just want to let you know that. Ashanti is one of She the People's 20 for 2020 list of women of color in politics who will play an impactful role in the 2020 elections. Prior to coming to Emerge, Ashanti served as the National Deputy Director of Community Engagement and Director of African American Engagement for the Democratic National Committee. She was the manager of national partnerships for the United Way Worldwide. And as a political appointee in the Obama administration at the US Department of Labor, she was the Director of Public Engagement. And she was also the Director of Public Engagement for the 2012 Democratic National Convention Committee in North Carolina. Welcome, Ashanti. Next up, we have Jonathan Metzl. Jonathan is the director for the Center of Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. He received his MD from the University of Missouri in Humanities and Poetics and did his psychiatric internship and residency from Stanford University with a PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan. He is a 2008 Guggenheim Fellow and has written extensively for medical, psychiatric, and popular publications. And Jonathan is the bestseller of the new book, the author of the best-selling new book, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. Welcome, Jonathan, and welcome, panel. So glad to have all of you here today. Why don't we kick things off, we'll start with opening comments from Ashanti.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to all of you watching. And I really do want to focus my opening remarks around the current health pandemic that we're in. And we know that stark racial disparities exist at every stage of our education system. And these disparities compound and contribute to inequity in economic, health, housing, and criminal justice outcomes. The COVID pandemic has finally shed a light on them in a way that most Americans have never seen before. The continued closures of schools this fall is likely to exacerbate inequalities felt by Black and Brown communities. It could also have long-lasting impacts on the nation's public school systems. New research that has just came out has shown that the average learning loss for students is 7 months if in-school instruction doesn't resume until January 2021. And we know the outcome would almost certainly be much worse for students of color. Black students may fall behind more than 10 months and Hispanic children by more than 9. And we know it's low-income students who will really be set back the most by more than a year. Some students were lost after learning turned virtual during the last school year, meaning that they were unresponsive to calls and emails after school buildings closed. One of the things that I have talked about for years is the fact that at-home internet access is a luxury that many communities of color, low income, and rural communities do not have. 19% of students from underserved backgrounds report having access to only one device at home. And for 56% of those students, that device is a smartphone. We have seen the photos of students sitting outside Taco Bells and Starbucks to use internet service for free. And we know that there are so many parents who have reported writing their children's papers on their phone. With the pivot to distance learning, many affluent parents are hiring teachers and tutors and creating learning pods or pandemic pods, which are small groups that meet in person to study. This practice will also leave behind disadvantaged students. While some learning pods are using their school's district virtual curriculum, others are offering private school education, which means kids could be leaving their public school districts, and we know that this will cause lots of districts to lose their funding. Why does this truly matter? It matters because we have to have leadership in this country that could have seen this coming. And it's clear that we need elected officials who will take action, not only to fix the immediate problems, but also to solve these structural issues. As an organization I work at, Emerge, we have seen our alums, these Democratic women, step up and fill these important gaps. At the onset of the pandemic, we have been talking about why leaders matter, especially at the state and local level. Some of the work that our alums have done, we've seen Virginia Delegate Danica Rome call for the federal government to revoke their policy forcing kids to be physically present at school sites to receive their meals. San Francisco Mayor London Breed has announced that the city will create learning hubs to support 6,000 disadvantaged students when San Francisco schools reopen for the fall with distance learning. Delegate Brooke Learman of Maryland has been a vocal advocate for students and called for the governor to be more thoughtful in his approach to reopening schools, especially in the underserved areas that are in the community that she represents. And we know in Baltimore, there's already underserved schools that did not have what they needed to even operate pre-COVID. So she wanted to make sure that they had the support that they needed when they did open under COVID. And I talked earlier about the students that have become lost. One of our alums, Rachel Rollins, who is the DA in Suffolk County in Boston, she made sure at the onset of this pandemic that we recognized that home was not safe for everyone, and that for students who deal with domestic violence and home violence, we needed to make sure that we were diligent in making sure that those social services were still available and amplified for these children and their families. At the end of the day, we need to build an education system that starts investing in our children at birth, and that helps every student get education beyond a high school diploma, whether it's a certificate, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree. We know that systematic racism is persistent across our institutions today, including our schools, and it must be addressed. And one of the best ways that we address this is making sure that we have the appropriate leaders in office who will introduce policies, laws, bills to change institutional racism in our education system across the country.
Thank you so much, Ashanti. And next, we will go to Wisdom.
Thank you.
Welcome, Wisdom.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, all right. We're off to a good start. It's not even morning. Good afternoon or good evening. Yeah, I think what's helpful for me to first acknowledge is I'm a school leader. And for most folks who aren't school leaders, they don't actually understand the truth of this statement. But there's nothing like Friday, 4 p.m. educator tired. You think you're tired, and until you've worked at a school, you don't understand what Friday, 4 p.m. educator tired actually means. So I'm not going to pretend to be more lively than I feel right now. I think that's important, especially because in this current time, aside from just the everyday difficulty of what it means to be a public school in America, when you add on both the failure of leadership at all levels of governance, I like to say all, but I think most levels of governance is probably fair, combined with not only the ignorance, but the what these days, the more I do this job, the more I realize, yeah, it's not that folks were at all ignorant to this chaos. What scares me more is those leaders who knew this was true before this reality arrived. And what troubles me is, regardless of what I think, the fact that they thought their self-interests were not aligned enough to be moved to action. Well, that's a really positive, enthusiastic opening. But to be honest, as a Black person in America, I think it was after the shot, the one who was just jogging, that I've stopped pretending. So I'd like to open with a few words on race, and then I'd like to mainly focus on the solution and the sort of vision that we're trying to create at Empower Community High School. I was originally born in Togo, small country in West Africa. We moved here when I was 9. And these days, what I think is, if as a 9-year-old who did not speak the language, if it took me a few weeks to understand how race operates in America, I don't understand how folks to this day are left in a state of misunderstanding. Because it's always been something that's been pitch clear. Maybe that's the gift of the immigrant who is not the native. But it was always extremely clear to me. And I remember the first sort of thought that has never left me, even to this day, is how could my brothers and I, who are coming from what you would call a third world developing country, arrive to this country 2 grade levels ahead of our peers? That was the first sort of reality that disrupted the myth of at least the American dream that we were chasing. And I think of this quote by Malcolm, and he says, when I speak, I don't speak as a Democrat, I don't speak as a Republican, nor as an American. I speak as a victim of America's so-called democracy. And he goes on to say, you and I, and he's talking to a room full of Black Americans, you and I have never seen democracy. All we've seen is hypocrisy. And when we open our eyes today and look around America, we see America not through the eyes of someone who has enjoyed the fruits of Americanism. We see it through the eyes of someone who has been the victim of America. And he finishes that line, which then Denzel just took to town in that movie. And he says, "We don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare." As an immigrant, I think I understand deeply the duality of those words. If you've never lived in a country where the average median income is $2 a month, you'd think American poverty is bad. And simultaneously, if you walk through this land in a Black body, there is no truer word than nightmare. And to this day, I really don't overcomplicate it, especially because when I work with children of all races, they are extremely capable of anti-racist thought, anti-racist behaviors, and anti-racist actions. It is not this elusive dream. It is an intentional design of these interlocking systems of oppression. It is not an impossible reality. And then when you remix that with education, first, they define the problem as an achievement gap, and that's convenient. We can't get these folks to perform on these assessments that are actually entirely biased to their cultures and modes of talking and language and communication. Okay. But there are known solutions for problems framed in that way. And I'll bring you one that's local. Tuition at Kent Denver is about $31,000 a year. The per pupil revenue in Aurora hovers around 8,000 to 9,000. So I really don't like to talk about problems that have solutions. Fund education like you fund your wars, and we're not going to be talking about gaps. What we focus on at Empower instead, well, we focus on our locus of control. And for us, it's the actual definition of education. What is the purpose of education? And in my experience, growing up in these public schools, teaching in them, and trying to co-create one with our community, it comes down to, again, one of the central tenets of democracy, which is the alignment of self-interest. Taking the time to actually organize community and reach an aligned definition of that. And when you do that, you realize, by our definition, actually, you're bastardizing the education of even white rich children. And I'll contextualize it in this example. I talked about, the one who was shot down while jogging. I don't fear that situation. I think about what education led to a man who shakes in his boots at the sight of a fellow man running in his neighborhood. What horrific miseducation leads to that sort of reality? And now you realize where the true achievement gap lies, the humanity gap. I'll fast forward through a bunch of things. For us at Empower, we define education as authentic education that is led by students, guided by educators, and co-created with community. It's a very purposeful mission statement. And the vision was written by a student whose name is Jay Carter. He was remixing lyrics from Nas, and he said, "The world is ours." It's very simple, it's actionable. Most school districts have incredibly long, complicated vision statements. That one actually puts it succinctly. At the end of the day, success is, I can navigate the economy of 2050. I can operate in a multilingual, multicultural world. Not this dangerous, false, Eurocentric predicament, but the reality, which is the actual globalized world we exist in. I can sustain healthy relationships with my family, my friends, my coworkers, my neighbors. I know how to love my community. And you notice I didn't say anything about the SAT. I'll stop there. I'm sure I'm over. And then we'll get to the good stuff, the dialogue. Thank you.
We'll get to the dialogue. All right. Thank you so much, Wisdom. Next, we'll go to Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much. It's really such an honor to be on this panel. I've really spent much of the past year really researching and talking about exactly what Wisdom was just talking about. Really, in my book "Dying of Whiteness," I look at the horrific effects of a system that undermines healthcare and education and safety for everyone. And in the book "Dying of Whiteness," I look at how cutting education systems, for example, ends up shortening, literally in the data I have, shortening white lifespans. People were voting for their lives to be shorter from 2 to 6 months just for the right to vote to oppress somebody else. And so I've been spending a lot of this election season talking about how to counteract that kind of zero sum thinking, this idea that there have to be winners and losers, when I think, as we've heard from the other two panelists, either we all win, or what's happening now, we all lose, and with very few exceptions. But I actually wanted to talk just for my 7 minutes here about a different project, even though I really would love to go back to whiteness in the Q&A if people want to. Um, but it's actually about an educational project that I've been involved in for the past 10 years called structural competency. I'm just going to make 4 points about that. This idea kind of came up. I went through medical school and did medical training. And through medical training, we learned that we had this model called cultural competency. Basically, it was an idea that trained medical students and doctors that they had personal responsibility for understanding the cultural backgrounds of different patients who came to them. And that was going to be a way of addressing kind of racial disparities in health outcomes. And then I was writing a book. The book before Dying of Whiteness was called The Protest Psychosis. And it was a book about the overdiagnosis of schizophrenia in Black men. I was looking at a particular series of hospitals for what were called the criminally insane in Northern Michigan. And I started this book with a fact. And the fact was that doctors were 7 times more likely to overdiagnose Black men with schizophrenia and underdiagnose them with every other mental illness you can think of: depression and anxiety and attention, all these kinds of things. And I went into the project with a kind of cultural competency lens, thinking that, well, that must have been because the doctors were racist. And if we trained the doctors to just see race in a better way, to be more aware of their own racial assumptions, that we could address that problem. And I spent about 5 years looking at this problem. I went through the archives of a bunch of different patients over the course of years. And what I found actually was something much more nuanced, really. I found that the diagnosis of schizophrenia through the 1950s had been a diagnosis that was predominantly given to white women in the hospitals that I was looking at. And the reason that was because a couple of reasons. One was because the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia through the 1950s said things like splitting of personality, calm and shy demeanor, withdraws from society, very kind of feminized diagnostic language. And the idea of treatment at the time was to kind of bring women in. They would kind of teach them sewing or knitting or home economics, and then get them back out into society. And that was true through the mid 1950s. And then all of a sudden, in the late 1960s, 1968, if you can believe it, all of a sudden, a bunch of shifts happened. One was that the diagnosis of schizophrenia changed, the actual language of schizophrenia changed. And the new language in the DSM-2, the official diagnostic Bible, was aggression, hostility, projection, basically blames, the quote was, blames other people for their problems, is aggressive toward the clinician, all these factors. So all of a sudden, very male, very masculinized, aggressive, racialized language in the diagnostic criteria. Another thing that happened was the advent of new psychiatric drugs that didn't want to restore people. Instead, they wanted to control their behavior. And the other thing was that there was a shift where there was less money for prisons at the time and more money for psychiatric hospitals. So psychiatric hospitals became the de facto home for the patients who were getting sent there, who, as I found in my book, were a lot, all of a sudden, of Black men who had been involved in social and racial protests in the 1960s. A lot of men who were in the Nation of Islam and Black Power movement and things like that. And I just went through the doctor's notes, and it was this kind of aha moment for me, because the doctors actually were trying to help a lot of the men who were being sent to them, but because of all of these bigger structural factors, changes in the diagnostic codes, changes in the treatment options, changes in the system itself. In a way, it was the system that was bringing the men to the psychiatrists, and lo and behold, all of these Black men started to get overdiagnosed with structural competency. And the factor that mattered wasn't so much the attitude of the doctor, whether the doctor was culturally competent. What mattered was that there were these bigger structural factors. And in fact, what happened after this moment in 1968 is psychiatric hospitals became more and more like prisons, and the hospitals that I studied actually literally became prisons as they became about 90% occupied by Black men. And so the idea was that even though individual responsibility was important, it wasn't important if you didn't understand what Stokely Carmichael calls the institutional factors driving racism, that these were invisible to people on the ground. Because what we're changing to think about Carmichael was, the zoning, the school boards, the tax infrastructure, where we put our money, what investments we tried to make, and who we feared as a society. And so it started me thinking that really we've been thinking about the politics of medicine in a pretty difficult and potentially wrong way. Not that doctors shouldn't understand their patients' backgrounds, but if you think about the racial problems that really are impacting health, with all due respect to doctors, their own attitudes are number 150 on the list. And the bigger things on the list are things like, where do you get your food, and transit systems? Do you live near a healthcare system? Do you have health insurance? All these bigger factors. And so from that came a movement called structural competency, this idea that for doctors to really intervene into health, they couldn't just have to be culturally competent. They needed to form alliances with communities, community groups, in a way to have a kind of humility to realize that every problem that looks like a medical problem isn't. It's also a social problem. It's also a political problem. It's also a question of investments. And that led to a series of changes. We've been kind of mobilizing around this idea of structural competency. Just in the last 2 minutes, I'll say that part of what we've done at Vanderbilt in a college setting is change. I run a 700 student curriculum, and we've changed our entire pre-med curriculum. Before it was, we still teach people science and stuff like that. But what we did is we changed our curriculum over to a structural competency model. And the idea was, yes, you're going to learn the science, but you also need to know the bigger structural variables. The kind of frame of our curriculum at Vanderbilt is we're going to take one concept, and that concept is structural racism. And if we teach students to understand structural racism, they understand all these other factors, because it turns out structure is very complicated. You have to understand what goes into a healthy structure, what creates an unhealthy structure, what resources, what taxes, what decisions, all these factors. And so we shifted our curriculum over to a pre-med program that really just teaches structural racism as its foundational concept, as a framework for illness and health. And the parents were freaked out when we did this. The administrators were freaked out when we did this. And lo and behold, what we found, we've had a lot of data coming out recently. Not that acceptance to med school is the only marker of anything, but our acceptance to med school went up to 84% in the last 2 years. So our acceptance to med school actually doubled. It's double the national average right now, and it's greater than the traditional pre-med program, because it's basically that if you look at health and illness in a social and cultural lens, you understand much better how health and illness works. And so I can post after this chat, but we're doing a bunch of other activism around this idea of structural competency, trying to do, I think, a lot of the things that we were hearing about earlier on in the panel, and things that Ashanti was talking about, which is reframing the healthcare system, thinking about the structures that create illness and health, and intervening on that level. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan. And now we will go back to our full panel for some discussion. And, before we jump into things, I want to, a question just came in that's following up immediately on what you just talked about, Jonathan, and it's asking, any other correlations between, did you find them between the institutionalization of activists from other social movements?
I'm sorry, what did we find in the 60s?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that book is called Protest Psychosis, and basically the idea was that how does society mobilize in response to the threat of Black men protesting in the streets, basically. And it turned out that what it does is it scares the crap out of white people, which is what we're seeing now with all this, looting on fire, pants on fire, everything like that. But it turns out that's a really strong motivator for quote unquote white flight or white anxiety. And so what we found was that society mobilized, man, I'm just getting emotional talking about this, because society mobilized not just to pathologize the protesters, it did it in a way that discounted the content of what was being protested, right? The minute you start calling it mental illness, who cares what they're protesting about, because it's insanity, right? And so putting this frame around it of mental illness was a way of discounting the content of protest. And so I think that the mechanism I saw at that time was really one in which society mobilizes to not take seriously Black political protests, honestly. And it has all these mechanisms about disinformation and calling it an illness and blah, blah, blah. But it does everything it can not to not to look at the actual content, right? And so I think for me, that was the organizing message. And I just saw that play out through every system I looked at. I mean, prison was obvious, but you would think doctors are there to help people, and doctors were trying to help people, but this logic became so pervasive. And for me, I'm answering it that way because I think that's an important lesson today, that we started with racial justice protests, and now we're on their terms talking about like looting, like as if somebody's like for looting, like, oh, we're the pro looting movement or something, but the thing is, when you change the channel that way, it just gives everybody the approval to feel good about, well, I'm for BLM, but I'm of course not for looting or something like that. So in a way, it's these logical leaps that I think are important, because honestly, we're just seeing this happen again right now.
And a common theme in all of your opening statements is that none of these issues are isolated, right? In educational inequality, it relates to an intersectionality that reveals itself, especially as you all talked about solutions, whether it's in mental health, moving beyond the hospital, and how do you navigate city systems, or say, homeless services that might come into play, or the political system, and how elections, candidates, and acting at local government, how that the intersectionality of that and education. So I'd pose this question to the panel, and maybe we'll begin with Ashanti. How do you see educational inequality? How do you see it being played out in national political elections now? And also, I'm just thinking in the discussion, we're talking about people who live under and experience two entirely different systems. And so if you're a political candidate and you're campaigning on education, which system are you speaking to? Whose votes are you trying to get? And how does all of that play into the political outcomes, the funding outcomes, and ultimately the educational inequality outcomes? So on that, I guess I will go to Ashanti. And
yeah, I mean, I'm going to be real honest here. There's only one candidate who is even really talking about education at the presidential level, and that is Joe Biden. And keeping with what I talked about with COVID is, we know Donald Trump doesn't have a plan for education and dealing with COVID. He doesn't even have a plan for COVID. And one of the things that I'm really impressed with the Biden-Harris campaign is you can actually find not only their educational plans for COVID, but throughout the educational system, including middle school, high school, technical school, HBCUs. That is extremely important. And this week we're learning more about the Bob Woodward interview and the things that Trump said. And a lot of it isn't shocking, but when we talk about education, this is a man who said that he sees no responsibility to even see, empathize with, relate to Black people in this country. That tells you everything you need to know about how he's viewing Black people in education, Black people in healthcare, Black people in prisons. It's just a whole bunch of talk. He has said that he does not care about us. And when we're looking at our educational system right now, we do need leadership. I did a panel with Women for Biden talking about Joe Biden's school reopening plan, and it is simple, yet it is effective with the way that he is thinking about all students. And one of the things that really stuck out for me, going back to what my fellow panelists have brought up, is with that mental health aspect, like he was the first candidate I actually heard talking about the mental health of these kids, how at-home learning is impacting them, how their home situation is impacting them, how students who have learning disabilities struggle with mental health aren't getting what they need. I don't know if everyone's familiar with the story of the young girl in Michigan who was sent to juvenile detention because her social worker felt that she wasn't doing the things that needed to be done with at-home learning. And the response was to throw her into juvenile detention. That has the opposite effect of what we need. So when we're talking about our system right now, it also has to be making sure that we're giving these kids the support that they need when they are returning to school, and they are 100% going to need it. We're going to need more school counselors. We're going to need more psychologists. So just keeping it simple, it's we need someone who's actually being thoughtful about this. And sorry, I just get upset thinking about it, but we have not gotten what we need now from this administration when it comes to education. You have a president who is threatening schools with losing their funding if they don't reopen, of course, not giving them the resources that they need. And we won't see anything better if we have another 4 years of this administration.
Thank you, Ashanti. And Wisdom, would you like to respond to that question as well? When you talk about do the decision makers, the politicians, the people in power, the people controlling the money and funding of education, how do they view other cultures, people of other races, and the impacts of that, and how that's all playing out? And of course, what you're doing with your school is a really unique and innovative way of addressing that. But to the same question, Wisdom, we'd love to hear from you. It's a lot.
And
it's a lot.
I don't know if this is, this could be the birth of my cynicism. What am I saying? I'm clearly cynic about the current reality. To be honest, I don't really give a damn who's in office. And the reason is these systems, institutions outlast individuals. They're built to sustain themselves. And whenever folks acknowledge, all right, we're talking about systems, we're talking about centuries of supremacy, of oppressive practices. We are under no sort of fantasies that, because the truth of the matter is schools weren't doing that for children anyway. Most okay? They're just doing enough to avoid a lawsuit. Schools were not, by and large, not feeding the souls of children, okay? Especially once they, honestly, there's a reason after third or fourth grade, the loss of learning can be, the loss of the desire to learn can almost be predicted. And of course, if we compound the other factors, yes, it only gets worse for the low income brown child. For me, those things, and I'm honestly sick of talking about those are very obvious things. Most people know. If they don't know, they can find out the truth somewhere. And what deeply concerns me is what you're bringing up in terms of, I think the original question was like the relation of education and who these political candidates actually have to speak to. And the number one educator right now is, it's not schools, it's Facebook and it's Web 2.0 platforms. It's realities that are dictated by algorithms. And the fact that those are actually, we're set on a critical, I think we might actually be past that point. I don't know, I'm not a seer, but we might be past the point where you can actually rein this thing back. And what that means for education is, you know, I ended that first part saying, if you notice, I didn't say anything about the SAT. I think if folks externally really understood the depths to which leaders in education systems and in systems of governance work backwards from one or two tests, and how much that dictates even how we spend the money that's allotted, versus if you actually begin with the outcomes, which is, how do I actually teach the child to teach themselves? How do I teach the child to love another? You work backwards from there. And let me get to the last sentence because I'll stay on this soapbox forever. You quickly realize, oh, this, anytime you start talking about education, it can just be so, things are so antiquated that, yeah, for anyone who's in the game, none of these things surprise us. And in fact, what scares me is that folks might not realize, my friends, worse things were happening before. Now at least we know about it and it's sort of publicly, like the kimono has been revealed. But ask folks what was happening 12 months ago, and you'll hear the same savage inequalities goes all outlined 20, 30 years ago. I don't even know if I answered your question. I just know I released some rage there. So let me know.
That's what this panel is about. We're changing the title to Releasing the Rage. No, thank you so much for very insightful comments on that, Wisdom. I will direct a question back to you, Wisdom, to follow up on that. With the model you've created in your school, how is that, do you see that as addressing these issues, or you know, dealing with them in a way that it seems like from what you said is, you don't, you know, is outside of this system that we keep talking about that's broken? If you could speak to that a bit.
Yep. One is, I always like to start with a caveat, which is we are a school startup in year 2. I'm under no means saying anything's perfect at Empower Community High School. I'll speak to the things, the seeds that right now give me hope. And there's one specific program that actually started with a group of students and teachers in March, basically when the first wave of the stay-at-home orders hit in Colorado, and it's called the Hustle Collective. And what it is, essentially, kids were reporting extreme boredom, actually, after being home for just an extra week after spring break. And then even once remote learning started, you know, what was reported nationwide, we also saw disengagement, a genuine, for me, of course, it's tied to folks not understanding that raw question, what is the purpose of education? Because yeah, now that I'm at home, the world seems to be sort of ending. Why should I give a damn about Algebra 2 right now? And basically, kids came together with an adult, and the Hustle Collective is simple. It's, you get access for that first pilot. It was $50 to $100, and the school can ship the supplies directly to your home. And it's just about, what do you want to learn? What is a skill a passion you've always wanted to explore. Kids chose gardening, watercoloring, guitar, singing. One kid chose aquaponics, interests wide and ranging. And then our job is to pair you with a hustle champion. And we specifically chose near peer mentors. So right now there's about 5 college students who are serving in those roles. And that's, again, intentional. It's to broaden your social capital, but also it's because if anyone here has actually ever taught themselves something, there's that first 2 weeks, and then you enter the pit of doom where you start thinking, this is much harder than I anticipated, and you're likely to quit. And you just need someone who's there to support you, who believes in you, and who's literally just crazy, basically a coach, not more complicated than a coach. And that's the program. Again, you didn't hear anything about, let me stop talking about tests. You can clearly tell how I feel about that. The reason that's key is that's actual authentic student-led learning. And I have faith, and I'll give you one tiny example. In our community meeting today, we were talking about this, and I get this kind of email from a kid, and for me, this is what gives me hope, is if I get more emails like this. A student was listening, and basically he decided, oh, here's something I've always wanted to do. You say, I want to basically create a podcast that's on feminism and male mental health, and a little on how they relate to each other and affect each other. And eventually, I want to bring people to our school and outside of our school to converse and possibly debate. All I need is a microphone, headphones, and help with figuring out how to record. There are all kinds of academic standards this kid's gonna hit, practice it, not even practicing, trying to make this thing happen. And aside from those academic standards, there are all kinds of entrepreneurial, executive functioning skills that the child is developing that actually makes me wish, all right, I wouldn't mind if you were my neighbor 20 years from now. Versus all right, no, I said I would stop. If I don't stop, I will keep ranting. Let me just stop. That's one such program that for me is it's aligned to a different model of education, and one that I believe is much more closely aligned to the future.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Wisdom. And Jonathan, what are your thoughts on the original question, but also responding to the panelists as well?
Well, I don't mind. Wisdom should please talk a lot. I mean, I love that. And I think that that's exactly right. I think that, I guess it's just the same for us. It's kind of like, whose standards are being enforced, and what are we doing when we enforce standards? It's just like this idea that there's like excellence in standards or non-excellence without the standards. So we find that a lot. I mean, obviously I'm at the other end, we're doing pre-med, but it's just funny. I mean, it's a financial and everything world away, except to say that the standards, you kind of see it at the other end of the spectrum, to kind of see who the standards are gatekeeping in a particular way. And so I too find, terror and hope in this moment. I mean, I do think I do hope that I do care about the outcome of the election, but I agree that people kind of fall into the trap of thinking that because you win an election or lose an election, that's the beginning or the end. And in fact, that's exactly right, that these structures are immutable, that in a way, so much of this stuff is preordained. And that's why I think looking at the structures themselves are important. But honestly, just really honestly, like, how can I help? Really, I mean, it's such a powerful question. How can we help think more creatively about adjusting the standards in a way that's enabling and not oppressing?
Interesting. And to go back to what you all said in your opening comments, and Jonathan, I'll ask you this: do you see these structures that Wisdom and Ashanti both spoke of as being similar to, in standardized testing and these structures acting as gatekeepers? Is it a pathology pathologizing race and through those structures, because a lot of what's come up in the panel has been to really, the kind of psychology and the role of mental, sound mental health, especially in children's ability to learn, and this a more holistic approach to it. Where you have teacher guided, but also student led and co-created education is what Wisdom's doing in his school. It just comes back to this idea of what is the mental health outcomes of students, and that pathologizing you saw of activism and race in the 60s and what happened in those mental health institutions. It seems to be somewhat related to these structures and systems, standardized testing, things that have been discussed, and pathologizing of race through that now, influencing outcomes.
I'm going to try to give some kind of uplifting answer toward the end of my rant about this, but you have to remember, I've spent the last good part of my life interviewing white Trump supporters in the South for dying of whiteness, and I'd say that the framework I think we have to fight against is this idea that here's the gate that the gatekeeper structures are doing, and below it is where we're keeping people who are oppressed by the system, and everybody above it is doing great and everybody's doing bad. And I don't know, I interviewed tons and tons of very poor white people about education, about healthcare, about their own lives. Like I interviewed people who they loved guns and they lost a child to gun suicide and they loved guns even more. And what I found was they were as poor as you could find, and they were getting as screwed by the system. I mean, in a very different way, but they were having falling life expectancy, horrible schools, and stuff like that, and they kept voting for their own horrible schools. And so it wasn't like, I mean, it wasn't like the gatekeep. It wasn't like there was a gate that everybody was trying to get through. And I would interview people. I mean, I'll never forget, like one of the interviews for the book, I interviewed a guy who was about 3 months away from dying. He was in his 40s and he had all these liver problems, and he needed health care, and he would not sign up for Obamacare because President Obama was Black and it was blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. And I said, you need health care or you're going to die. And he said, well, I don't want my tax dollars going to a system, as he said, that's going to help Mexicans and welfare queens. That was the thing I heard again and again in this research, was this idea that basically I'm not going to support a system that, by this logic, is going to support undeserving immigrants and minorities. And I heard that particularly in the education research also, people would vote for cuts that eviscerated their own kids' schools when people would start to tell them, well, there was this myth in the Kansas research I was doing. People were saying these Black school districts are taking all your money and they're buying luxury party buses for football games. And the Black school districts actually couldn't afford textbooks, but this idea that the Black districts were wasting the tax money of white people, it led people to vote for cuts to, they saw their own kids dropping out of school. And so I think that the issue is not just about above and below a disparity line. It's also about this logic, this wage of whiteness, going back to Du Bois, this idea that basically, you want to be better than the other guy, that leads to this zero sum formulation, basically, this idea that there are winners and losers, and I'm going to be a winner, make America great again. So I think the issue is not just about funding, it's about addressing, really for me, addressing what Du Bois wrote about in the period after Reconstruction, right? This idea that basically people with common economic interests can't join together to create better lives for everybody. That's a kind of the story of American racism in a way. And so really the logic isn't just about money. It's really a logic about how can we overcome this idea that people can't join together. And Trump is playing on it. And it's weird, if you read Black Reconstruction, the Du Bois book, I don't know, it almost feels like I would compare our period now to the period after Civil War, and I don't know which time has got a more intense version of this right now. And so, it's pretty deep right now. But just think about how little progress we made on that narrative. And for me, that's the narrative. It's the polarization narrative. It's not just the resource narrative.
Great. And before we get back to things, I just want to let the audience know that you can pose questions in the Q&A link on Zoom. And also, if you're on YouTube, you can post questions there, and we will try to get those to the panel in the session. Ashanti, I wanted to ask, what do you see as the most immediate, the biggest change in approach to education post-COVID that needs to be made, especially as pertains to curriculums that approach U.S. history as it's being rewritten today through an equity lens?
That's a really great question, and I'll answer this in the terms of the 1619 project, which is something that is so well written. It's also a podcast. I highly recommend everyone listen to the podcast. And you have educators in school systems who are already incorporating the 1619 project into how they're teaching slavery and Black history. And you're seeing a backlash from several people that don't like that this is being taught. They're calling it rewriting history, but the fact is, it is history. When I even think back to the things that I learned in my history book, it was, the Civil War was really fought over the South's right to secede from the Union. Over slavery, they wanted to completely ignore that part in the history books that I was taught. So it comes down to who is running these school systems and what that curriculum is going to look like. But the important piece here is, who are the people writing that curriculum? If you want it done through an equity and justice lens, that means that you have to have Black, Brown, and Indigenous people writing that curriculum. And I feel it's a real conversation a lot of people aren't ready to have yet. And it even gets me thinking about the future, because right now, this is history. What we are living through is going to be written in history books. And how it's portrayed is going to be decided by who are the people who are going to write about this time. So the biggest thing is we need to make sure that there are the people in place who come from these communities, my community, who are going to really tell what it was like to be a Black person in the middle of another summer of full-on anti-Blackness, what it was like to be an Indigenous person when they were putting pipelines on your land, what it was like to be a member of the Latino community and see kids locked in cages. The only people who can truly write about those are the ones who experienced it and who are from those communities. And that means that we need people in the system who are going to make sure that that happens, or else we're just going to see these past few years, again, whitewashed. And then students will have to take the African American studies, the Latino studies, the Indigenous studies to find out more about the real history of this country. And I even think back to when Trump wanted to do a rally in Tulsa on Juneteenth. What was trending on Twitter? What is Juneteenth? Most people didn't even know what it was. They hadn't been taught that in school. They still think the 13th Amendment completely abolished slavery. They had no idea we celebrate Juneteenth in the Black community because that is the day our people actually became free. We just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And people are like, women have had the right to vote for 100 years. Some women have had the right to vote for 100 years. That wasn't all of us. So it's making sure that you have the people there who can portray the real reality of these times.
Yes. And Wisdom, I'd ask your response to that question as well, but also, what are you looking to do in your own school and model to, in terms of teaching that history through an equity lens, which is, as Ashanti pointed out, so you don't have to take the Latinx studies, the indigenous studies, the African American studies, but this is knowledge. This is the history of a country that everyone, all people need to know about.
Yep. For us, the concrete, direct answer is we have a 4-year ethnic studies program. So we've combined ELA and social studies and are developing a multicultural 4-year ethnic studies curriculum. And something that's also key is, in fact, nowhere on our website on purpose will you find the words low-income students or even students of color. And now we serve predominantly founding class was 50% Latinx, about 28% Black, 14% white, and then the rest either unknown or mixed. And what was key about that for us is that reflected the larger demographics of the community. And it's for lots of reasons. It's, and this is, I promise, tied to your question. The way those phrases have been used in this sector typically leads folks to immediately enter the situation with all kinds, like the schema is already biased. And we find we actually there's a lot of unlearning and undoing we have to do for folks so they can actually serve the children. And then B, for me, it also looked, I think of the quote from Socrates, to find yourself, think for yourself. And we're trying to make sure we stay, I'll bring you into an actual conversation we're having this week where we have families who occupy the entire political spectrum. We have, as you know, it's a racially diverse school, missing in Asian or Pacific Islander representation and indigenous representation. But folks on any one topic, to be honest, there are schools like ours that exist in places like Oakland with vastly different, it's just different cultures. And what it's forced us to do is actually hold true to one of the central tenets of education, which is it's not indoctrination. It's guiding your process of discovery. And with things like, literally from this summer, if a school didn't change its curriculum from everything that happened in the last 6 months, again, for me, that's more the problem than whatever the new hot topic is. Because I'm sure 10 years from now, education's good at that. 10 years from now, it's going to be some other hot topic that we want in schools. Great, okay. And regardless, I go back to, and then I'll shut up. I didn't really mean it doesn't matter who's in office. I just mean what is actually more sustainable is an educated, engaged citizenry that is aligned in terms of values. And for me, that's when I actually try to understand democracy, because even democracy to me, I'm like, I'm not convinced it's a duh thing. When I analyze democracy, I'm like, that's what you actually need for this experiment to work. And then you see how piss poor this nation's schools and its outcomes are, and you understand, the next 20 years, it's like combined with the weaponization of technology. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I'm with Jonathan. I just feel like, dang, the only path forward sometimes seems to be either some sort of miracle or some sort of civil war. I'm not advocating for that, but sometimes I struggle to see that I ended in a dark place again. Let me pass it.
We still have time on the panel. We're gonna bring it all home at the end. Jonathan, if you could, in addition to responding to that question, and you fellow panelists, Again, I mean, I'd also tack on a little extra question, which is this teaching of one's own history, a true history, because it's like Ashanti said, when I was in school, as you get older and you investigate these things, you find out how much you were not taught and how much was inaccurate, and how much of what was left out and what was invisible and what is inaccurate pertains to non-dominant races and ethnicities and their role in building and establishing and founding this country. If you were teaching students of color, students of minority students and immigrants, these false histories of themselves, just think of the self, how is anyone supposed to have any self-esteem if you're being taught these lies about your people, and you're not being taught, the whether you're Black, Latino, Indigenous, how you built this country, to give that sense of ownership, and that sense of belonging, and to, what Wisdom talked about for democracy to function, this idea of common community, community and feeling together. How can anyone even feel a part of that if you're being taught these false histories, and then you're expected to, to go through a school system uh, being taught that way while you're sitting next to classmates who are being taught you invented everything, you're always going to be great, you were the dominant ones. And then you all have put everyone together in these education systems. Everyone is going to come together at some point in them. So it was kind of a comment and question in there, piggybacking off of some of the discussion we just had. But I'd be interested to see what you have to say, Jonathan.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. I mean, responding to the great comments from both the panelists. I mean, thinking about Wisdom's point about, how are you not going to change your curriculum after this 6 months? And on one hand, I'm a structuralist, right? And so I think that schools existed within structures. It's kind of like doctors aren't going to change racism by being more racially conscious because they're existing in a racist structure, right? So you have to change the structure. Otherwise, the doctors, it's frustrating. Doctors want to help and they can't. It's the same thing with education. So I think part of the caveat for me is that I think we risk overvaluing the importance of what education can do if it's not tied to other structural changes, right? It's too much pressure to fix systemic racism. You can teach people their history, you can teach people to be great leaders and things like that. But think about this pandemic, for example. This thing hit in March, or obviously earlier now we're finding out. But there was a moment where we didn't think it was coming. And then when we realized it was coming and what it was just this like, oh shite moment, right? Where everybody in a different way was vulnerable. We were vulnerable because we were humans and we had no immunity to this new pathogen, right? And it was a particular kind of pathogen that, at least in the beginning, we were vulnerable because of our mail or our packages. But the main way we were vulnerable was because you couldn't talk to people. You couldn't talk to people who were different than you. They could be vectors and all these kind of things. And so there was this moment of terror that at least everybody experienced in some way, in some way. And then it became pretty clear quickly that that not everybody was vulnerable in the same way, right? It became pretty clear that minoritized communities were vulnerable, not because of genetics, not because of biology, but because of the structures that were vulnerabilities in our system before, right? They were vulnerabilities about housing and education and finance and all these factors. And at that moment, we really had a choice to make as a society, right? I mean, for me, the lesson of this pandemic is that moment, right? The moment is either we are dying because people in our country, our fellow citizens, our fellow non-citizens, we're dying because we're all vulnerable as humans and we are going to join together, or they are dying, those other people, those are people. And like our establishment chose they are dying. I mean, that they are dying moment, that to me is the moment of the pandemic right there. That's what got us to everything, right? Because when we didn't see structural inequity as an American problem that made us all vulnerable, just the same way that education is. The whole system, it reflects our values, and we're all, screwed in a way. And so in a way, that moment, and I can give you a lot of examples of societies that face that moment, the most existential moment. The United Kingdom, for example, during the Second World War, there was a blockade, not enough food, being bombed. And what they said is, instead of creating inequities, we're going to democratize access to food. We're going to democratize access to healthcare. And it turns out in Britain, life expectancy went up 5 to 7 years during and after the Second World War when they were being bombed, because they made a fair system, and that led to the creation of the National Health Service also. So decisions societies make at this moment set the stage for the country for the next 100 years or more. And I feel like that for me is the lesson that needs to be taught about the pandemic. Is we, just like after Reconstruction, we risk making the wrong decision. Now we can still write that course, but for me, that's the educational moment, when we saw other people dying and we saw them as them and not us. That was a kind of tangent, but to me, that's my emotional response to what we're talking about.
Thank you. And we're moving into the final minutes of the panel, so maybe just take a minute or two to answer this next question. And I'm going to try to pool. We've had a bunch of questions coming in, so I'll try to pool them all into one closing question. Which and Wisdom, we're going to try to get you a chance if you like to, end on a positive note. But I will say that I don't believe anything was not positive in this discussion. It's just you're all being realistic. You're telling the truth, and you have to speak the truth. And labels like negative and positive don't always have to mean as much when you speak. It just matters that you're speaking the truth. And to that point, if you would all speak your truth for just a minute in closing comments about what do you see as the biggest, the biggest issue that people should be paying attention to change, and maybe what is, one thing that people can do going forward to, impact this big issue of structural racism, and that might include, do you do away with tests, or, like Wisdom, do you think we can change the tests to be more equitable or through an equity lens? So I guess, what do you see as the biggest key issues people should be paying attention, and what's something people can do to tackle these issues? Ashanti.
What I would like to see is more educators in elected office helping shape what happens. So I don't think anyone's surprised that's my answer, but that's what it is. We need the people who know what it's like to be in a classroom every day, who are connected to these students. We talk about a reflective democracy, but what I want is an inclusive democracy where we see the everyday people making the decisions because they know the real impact. Nevada became the first female majority state legislature, and the youngest woman serving there is an Emerge alum named Selena Torres, and she was encouraged to run for that position by her students. She is a teacher, and I think it's amazing that at that young age she ran, but the fact that her students knew that they needed their teacher in office in order to make things better for them. So for me, I think that is a way to really start to make this system better. Educational system, the laws, the policies, the bills that are written about it, they should have teachers there. They should have teachers making those decisions, voting on those bills, because they are the ones who know how to make this better.
And Wisdom, and then we'll close with Jonathan. Just about a minute each. Try to get into these closing comments.
Yeah, at the end of the day, for me, it always comes back to leadership. And first, a quote from Cornell, and he says, if you define good leaders as those who are well adjusted to injustice and well adapted to indifference, then we don't want good leaders. We want leaders who love the people enough to be unbought, unbound, unafraid, and unintimidated to tell the truth. And at every damn sector of this, every sector, every level of this operation. And for me, I pair that with a concept, I think Juno Diaz remixing Richard and talking about imaginative excellence. And that as the only tool we have to cultivate radical hope under such, under like the empire. And if I combine those two things, it's what gives me hope to keep trucking along. It's eventually an ecosystem of leaders capable, and I have to say that, but capable, first of all, of critical thinking, grounded in the values of their community, and yeah, for me, that the how is always much more clear than what it all ends up looking like. That's for each community to decide. And in terms of like tangible actions, in Aurora, we're trying to build a Wakanda in Aurora, a space where our children and the adults can have a space where they can actually be free, and what that means for their development. So I'll leave you for that. Thank you.
Excellent. And Jonathan, can I
Man,
close
I
this
love
out
that.
today?
I mean, I just when I amplify what the other two panelists have said, it's so important. I mean, I've been, and by the way, I apologize for going all Blair Witch Project here. It got dark in New York over the course of the panel. I've been getting in a lot of trouble for saying this, but I've been trying to speak to white people because I think this election really matters. It really matters. And I feel like to be a white ally right now, it's important to show up, to be unwavering, to show support. But I also think it's the responsibility of white people right now to talk to other white people, particularly white people who are voters in swing states. Because I think right now, that's not a job that we should shirk in a certain kind of way. So I've been saying that if you really care and you want to show up and you show support, don't just talk to people you agree with. Figure out strategies for talking to white swing state voters who you can form some kind of conversation with or something like that. So I think there's a lot of responsibility now that this question of equity and justice is one that we all share, and there are certain things that white people can and should be doing now that are actually tied to not just signaling, but also actually thinking about the electoral process and what it'll take to win this election.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And that's going to close out a panel today on racial impacts on education equality. Such an outstanding panel. Thank you so much, Ashanti Golo, Wisdom Amuzu, Jonathan Metzel, for amazing comments and discussion today. Thank you for watching today, audience. Linked in the YouTube chat, and after you close the Zoom session, we invite you to participate in a short questionnaire survey. Additional preparations are already underway for CWA 2021, and CWA relies on the generosity of people like you to make this event possible. So please consider making a gift to CWA. Go to www.colorado.edu/CWA. Thank you so much for joining us today. That closes out the panel. I am moderator and host Nikhil Menkekar, and have a good night.
That was great, you guys. Let's stay in touch.